I am here to introduce now Michiel Mulders, and he is going to be doing a talk on developer experience in technical writing, 15 practical tips to boost developer satisfaction, which is really good because developers are so often our users, and as we did in the last talk, about user-focused documentation, we should really be doing user-focused experiences. And this is exactly what he's going to be bringing to the party. So take it away, Michiel.
Thank you. All right, this is the first time I'm actually doing this talk. It's a culmination of me starting as a developer. Then I progressed to developer relations, consuming a lot of docs, writing a lot of docs, and now I actually ended up doing documentation consulting. So this talk is basically like a condensed version of like everything I learned in like all these roles, all these functions, and I just want to get started. And actually this thing got covered in the previous talk as well. It's a what's new page. Instead of having like these boring release notes, you link to GitHub issues, I saw that the cello.so docs, they actually started using like more interesting, more engaging snippets. For example, here you see like they show like the changes that have happened in the UI, or they show like which kind of code snippets have changed. And this really made it more engaging for developers to like start using the docs. So I also started using this. So for example, my client Minblue, they did like a big UI update. And here I want to show like what's the old interface and what's the new interface. And one thing that I could have maybe done better here is I could have drawn like lines between the old and the new UI so you could really see like what has changed. And it also gets like an extra benefit of like you signal to the users that your product is like active. You're like making changes constantly, and it's like a really nice thing to have. And that's why I also usually put it like pretty high up in the documentation architecture. Then the next thing that I really value is documentation search. And this is one thing that I often see like docs projects or like technical writing teams, they don't pay a lot of attention to the analytics that your documentation search can provide. And for example, a lot of the tooling allow you to configure your documentation search. So you can configure it to work with Algolia. It's a search provider that actually has been designed for e-commerce, but it actually works surprisingly well for like documentation projects as well. And we can get like a lot of information from it. So the first metric that we can get from it is like, how often does a user see like a no results page? So they look for something, and no results are being returned. If this number is like pretty high, it means like something is wrong. They're looking for some kind of feature or content, and it's just not showing up in your results. Another thing is the click-through rate. Like, how often does a user click through on the search result? If this number is like pretty low, it means like your documentation search is not properly configured. Like, if it's like 20%, it means like only 1 in 5 times when a user searches for something, they're clicking through, so it means they're not finding the information they need. And finally, it's a similar metric, it's a no-clicks rate. So how often does a user look for something and doesn't click on any of the results? These are like pretty useful metrics that you can actually leverage when you're improving content. For example, you notice you're not using the right keywords in some of the titles, which means they're not popping up high enough in your search results. You can start like experimenting with this and can see if these rates are improving. Then is this is the average click position. It's one of my favorite metrics. It shows you like on average on which search result the user is clicking. So for example, if they're clicking on the first to the third result in the search result, it means your documentation search is actually pretty well configured because the user is like scanning the first 3 results, and then they decide like, this is an interesting result, I'll click on this. However, if the number is like higher, between 4 to 6, it's a sign like not the right pages are popping up. And I've seen this a couple of times with clients where they have like API reference guides and they have like the keyword of their function name like quite often in these reference guides. It's obvious. It's normal that it comes up a lot of times. So that's why these pages were like popping up quite high in the search results because the keyword was there quite a lot, while the tutorial was like buried in like the 9th or even the 10th result. And we can actually fix this. So before, Algolia had like a system where you could assign weights to certain pages. So what I would do usually is I would assign like a way higher weight to like a tutorial or a how-to guide, and I would give lower weights to reference guides. This solved the problem, But sometimes when you're an advanced user and you still want to get to these API reference guides, that would just not pop up. So that's also the reason why Algolia decided to just abandon this custom ranking system, and they introduced dynamic re-ranking. It's a system that's events-based, so you can't really control it, but it's a smart system. It uses some AI. For example, you release a new feature. Suddenly, a lot of users, they start looking for this new feature. The AI will detect a change in events, lots of users requesting this new feature, so it will start prioritizing this documentation page about the feature. In the beginning, it will start pushing the getting started guides, because it sees that not a lot of users are clicking through on the reference guides, but they're often clicking on tutorials and how-tos. But then over time, users get more familiar with your feature, so they're starting to look for API reference guides. So the system also kind of understands at what learning point the average developer in your docs is. They will understand if it's a new feature, we should push getting started guides. If it's a more advanced, over time users become more advanced, we should push how-tos or reference guides. And then there is this interesting problem. I had one client where they called their API token an SDK token. And we saw a lot of people were looking for API key because it's common terminology. And they were not getting any results. They were getting no result pages, which was a red flag. So we decided to set synonyms. It's a feature that Algolia provides as well, where you can say the word SDK token is the same as API key, token key, access key, or authentication key. And this way, if the user has they come maybe from a different field where they use a different name, these pages will still pop up in the search results. So it's a clever way to tell the search system prioritize, or if the user searches for something, give them a different page. Then one cool thing that I really like is demo pages. They're not super interactive, but they can show value to the user very quickly. So a demo page helps you visually see what kind of impact have certain configurations on my product. So this is a privy demo. It's a social authentication layer, and you can play around with the background, the accents, and you can enable and disable certain login systems. You can see how it changes in your UI, and this is pretty nice, because otherwise you have to do it locally. You have to make changes in your config, deploy it again, or run it locally to see how it changed. Now we can just do it all from this UI, and then you can actually copy the configuration to the clipboard, do the installation, and within a couple of minutes, previous says it takes 9 minutes, you're fully set up and you have a working product just by starting with this demo. So it really reduces the time for developers to get to this first meaningful value. And that's why it's also important as an extension of your documentation to have these kind of demos to shorten the time to meaningful value. Playgrounds are actually similar, but they're more interactive. And I want to highlight a quote here from Marcus Placona. He said that 90% of developers abandon your API if they can't get a working example in 5 minutes. And this really stresses the importance of why you should have a playground. Because a playground, it usually it allows you to run code in the browser. You don't have to do local installation, which might already take 5 minutes of the developer's time. So by eliminating this, the developer can dive straight into experimenting with the code. So here is an example from Leo. Leo has built a custom developer sandbox or a developer playground, and they've populated it with loads of examples. It's a new smart contract language, so it's really hard to understand what's going on and how to build proper use cases. For example, the first example is an auction example, and by populating these examples straight into the playground, users can play around with it. They can make changes. They can deploy it, and they can see how small code changes have an impact on the actual result. So again, this is a great way of giving the developer a tool to quickly experiment with their technology, see what impact it has, and just get to more meaningful value. So at Adera, they invested quite heavily in a custom playground. So this playground cost around $500,000 to build in developer fees, but it's an interesting one Because first of all, it caters to multiple users. We have like a quick start on the left, where you can click together certain flows. For example, I want to create an account on the blockchain. You can just click on this code example. It will load it into the playground. You can execute it, and you can directly get like the results. There's also like a chat agent where you can ask questions, ask clarification, and provide context to the chat agent. But then, interestingly, we also included a lot of other things, like all the SDK methods, all the functions are included, so you can start building more advanced scripts. So this also caters to more advanced users that don't want to play around locally. They just want to do something more quickly in the web browser. They can say, I want to create an account, I want to create HTS tokens, and I want to create an NFT, for example. You just paste it together. You have a script, you can copy it to your local machine, and just run it. So again, it reduces the time for advanced users as well to build something without having to consume a lot of docs about different features. You just play around as the agent, and you get to more meaningful value much quicker. And one extra cool feature, you can switch languages. But if you're on a smaller budget, there are still great solutions. So for example, for GraphQL APIs, there's like a GraphQL sandbox or an Explorer, which you can just embed in your own documentation. It's like an iframe that you can embed within your docs so people can play with an actual query straight from your documentation. Another example here is like the famous code sandboxes, where you can just load your full code example into the sandbox. All of the dependencies have been pre-installed. You just have to add your API key. You can execute the code and play with it. Again, this can also be embedded within your documentation. All right, let me have a sip. So next, I want to discuss like the trailhead approach. So I see documentation as a trailhead at the start of a walk. Like you're at the start and you have like, for example, one trail is like 5 kilometers, the other trail is like 8. We can apply the same principle to like building your overview or your landing page for documentation. Like instead of forcing all your users to like one generic onboarding guide, it's much more efficient to like define persona paths straight from the overview page. So for example, if you're a developer on Avalanche, you're most likely interested in building your own application on Avalanche. But if you're an infrastructure provider, you're more interested in launching your own mini blockchain within their blockchain. And if you're an artist, you want to maybe mint a token on their chain. So all these personas have different outcomes. And you don't want to force them to like a generic guide, for example. You don't want to force like an artist to a guide that says like how to create an API key, because it's not necessary for him. He doesn't care. So by segmenting straight from the overview page, you can get developers to more meaningful value much quicker. If you then look at the Polygon docs, they did like a similar thing. They segmented like the building phase and the learning phase. So if you're a developer that's more interested in building, you have like a lot of building resources. If you're like still in the learning phase, you want to understand like their complex technology, there's like a lot of learning pages. If we then look at the docs from Privy, the same one that we just saw, they have like loads of products. They have like SDKs in all kinds of languages. They have server SDKs. Instead of like making it really complex, they just chose for like a simple layout. They list all of the products, and this is like the landing page for their documentation. They send you straight to the right product. So then I decided to create a path or the user flow that I intend for the documentation of a client. So this client is MintBlue. And here, instead of making the decision straight on the first landing page, we actually decided, because it's a new product, we first want the user to start learning about why to use MintBlue, like what is it about, then introduce the products, and only then we want to make the decision point. So first, we send them through a quick start, where they can create like an API token, and then they can go through the 3 different products, which is event listeners, SDKs, or Zapier integration. And additionally, because a lot of advanced users, they want to experiment directly with like a real application. They don't want to go through SDK stuff or like getting started guides. They just want to see how does it work like in a real environment. So that's why I also included the decision point straight from this overview page or like even before to go to example applications. And this way, I could like visualize the flow that I intend developers to take throughout my documentation. And one thing that's really important, like, oh, sorry, like instead of like you give them like the overview point where you decide like which flow do I take, but then you don't let loose. You use like what should I learn next components to like guide the user at each tutorial, like where should I go. This really helps the user to like find the right place and the right flows that are intended for them. Developers will get lost. They will click around. They will go to other pages. But by having these clues at the end of each tutorial, they will notice like, they're trying to send me on like a certain flow. Let's try this flow and let's learn it. So the flow is designed to make them help learn as quickly as possible. Then one thing that I often see is like the side quest hell. You're like following a tutorial and suddenly you see like, there's another guide linked. What should I do? Should I follow it? Should I not follow it? It's confusing. I hate it. And then at some point I was following like a tutorial that linked another tutorial that linked another one, and in the end, I just ended up with the same tutorial. In my opinion, tutorials should be just straight flows, no side quests at all. You just get to the value in one single line, and don't use side quests. However, if you still want side quests, there is a solution for this, the prerequisite section. So in the prerequisite section, it's like a fencing, a gatekeeping mechanism where you can say, you need to complete a certain tutorial, you need to have like a certain key, or you need some kind of knowledge before starting this tutorial. So it's a really great way to make sure that people have like completed the right actions instead of linking like side quests within a tutorial. Then we've come to documentation structure. And documentation structure for me is like something really important. If you do it well, a user can like look at your documentation information architecture and understand by just looking at the architecture where to find which kind of information. If he's looking to solve a specific problem, he will go to like how-to guides. If he's like learning about the product, he will go to tutorials. And by structuring it nicely, it will make it much more clear. So the different types of documentation usually are like a generic quick start, we have tutorials, how-to guides, your API reference, and then changelogs and core concepts. So this is the diataxis framework. It's like widely used in technical writing, I would say. And it defines like where would you put which kind of information. So tutorials are always like learning oriented. So you're like learning, you're in the learning phase, you're trying to learn a new product, but it's practical knowledge. So you go to a tutorial, and tutorials are always like step-by-step based. They include like all details, everything that you need to onboard. And then if you learn more about the product, you end up with like how-to guides. For example, you're like working and you encounter a specific issue, or you're trying to solve a specific problem, or you want to get to a goal. This is when you will consume like a how-to guide. Because how-to guides, they provide like, they don't provide like all the onboarding steps, but they show you like a code snippet, explanation, and they really help you quickly to solve your problem. So that's the main difference between tutorials and how-to guides. If we then take another look, we have explanations. They're also in the learning phase, but theoretical. They give you like more information about like the context, the architecture. They just take a step back and provide like this background information. And then finally, there is reference guides. It's also in the working phase, but it's more theoretical knowledge, like which kind of output parameters or input parameters do you need to provide. Then I want to compare these two information architectures. The first one is feature-based. And you often see like feature-based documentation. It's nice, it works well, you list the different features, you have like a tutorial or a getting started guide for the feature, and then you have like multiple how-tos. However, there's like a different way of structuring your documentation. Instead of doing things feature-based, you can do it like flow-based. For example, in the flow-based example, we introduce like one feature, then we introduce another feature, we combine features, we add some extra complexity, and then finally you end up with like a deployed application. So a real-world application that shows you like how to do things, and it shows you like really like how to use the technology in a real-world application. So it's a way different way of structuring the documentation, but it's also a really interesting one because it gets you to value much more quickly. So I've lost count of how many tips I've had. I think this is tip number 10. Designing documentation for like the super duper advanced user. So my friend, when I was interviewing him, I noticed he was like scanning through the documentation and was like wondering, why is he doing this? Is he a fool? He was not a fool. He was actually like a super duper advanced user. So if you design docs, they're often designed for like beginners or like medium users, but we often forget about like these advanced users. They need like different kind of contents. The first thing that we noticed was like the reading pattern. Instead of like consuming the docs with every detail, instead of consuming every detail, they would like scan through the docs, they would look for keywords, they go through it. Another thing that we also noticed is they favor different kinds of content. Instead of favoring like onboarding guides, they would go to like deep dives, architecture review, cost comparisons, how to scale it, how to embed it in like complex architecture. So we didn't have these kind of pieces, and they were looking for it. So it was a whole different mentality. Also, the focus is different. They are really interested in like how does it work under the hood instead of just does it work. And finally, their intent is also different. They're interested in like how to integrate this piece of software in a complex system. Then I want to introduce smart changelogs. This is actually a feature that I discovered through Teneo. It's also a documentation platform, and it's only for API-based products. So if you have an API, open API specification, you can upload it in Teneo, and each time the specification changes, it will automatically detect changes, breaking changes, or new endpoints, deleted endpoints. And this is really useful because they provide like quick filters on the top. You can quickly filter for like what's breaking, and you can immediately see, oh, this is a breaking change, I should update it. And then the cool thing is, you can subscribe for these updates. So you get these updates straight to your inbox, you get notified when something breaks, and as a developer, it's a great experience because I don't have to go to them to find information, they're sending it directly to me, so it's like a pull. Then boilerplates. Boilerplates are also kind of connected to developer experience because they allow you to quickly start a new project with all the best practices included. So it's like a scaffolding template where you include all your best practices and you show how to build a real application with your technology. You can see like a lot of the main frameworks that will have it. For example, Fast API has a command, Django admin has one. And if you want to build your own, you can often use like the Create React app component, where you can specify your own template, and it will load all the best practices on top of it. And then one cool thing that I discovered as well is interactive learning. It's really hard to build, in my opinion, but if you have it, it's like a cool thing. For example, the Encore.dev blog, they had like they want to introduce the concept of like last in, first out, or first in, first out. And they had like this visual example where you could spam the button. Each time it would send a request to the server indicated by the black icon. If there were too many requests would drop and you would see a red circle. You can see it here as well. And if you reach the goal, it would like strike it through. So it was like a nice way of like you're reading a tutorial and then you can like play with it. I was like, wow, this is a cool thing. And then next, content discoverability. Sometimes I come across like products that have like loads and loads of interactions, integrations. So for example, the Morales docs, they have like 30 blockchains integrated. And it's really hard for them to create like an information architecture where everything is like easily discoverable. It's just not possible. So the solution here for them is like they built like a separate page where you can look for like information. They include popular searches, and like it makes their content a bit more discoverable. The same is true here for the Binance Academy. They have like close to 700 articles in their academy, but they provide like loads of cool filters. For example, you can filter by like the difficulty. If you're a beginner, if you want advanced content, there's loads of like topics, and they even have like length filters. It's not on there, but I believe they had them. But this makes content like a lot more discoverable. Then there is video content. Video content for me is like an integral part of your documentation. You should not add like video content to every flow or every guide, but it's still useful to have it in a lot of places because you have like visual learners, and it's still nice to like go through a tutorial and then you can cross-reference it within your video. I'm rushing through because I don't have a lot of time. Code checks. Code checks are for me a great point of like checking in with the user. If you have like a very long tutorial, you can add like code checks within your guide. So a user can like cross-check, am I still doing the right thing or am I wrong? You can copy the code and you can like move on. It's really frustrating when you're doing a tutorial and midway through, things start failing, you don't know why, you have to roll back steps, you have to undo code. It's really frustrating. And that's where code checks are like super useful. I always include them at the bottom of a tutorial, so you can always make sure you have like the right code. Then we have code highlighting. So if you look at the left example, you just see some text and a code snippet, but you don't understand like what's the relationship between the code and the text above, like what is it referencing? A solution I often see is like, we add some comments to the code snippet to indicate I'm talking about this piece of code. However, documentation platforms nowadays, they offer like some good solutions. For example, on the right, you can see there's code highlighting. You can just highlight a line of code, and it immediately makes a connection between the text and the code really obvious. Another solution here is to like blur, but I'm not sure if that's like the best example. But one I really like is the differentiate example, where you can show like what's the previous state, what's the new state, and the user can immediately see like what should I change in my code. And then finally, the ultimate documentation for me is Stripe. They have like amazing docs. They have like a super long code example, and instead of like having to copy the code example each time for every step, the code example stays on the screen, and every time you switch between the different blocks on the left, a different line of code will be highlighted in their document, in their code snippet. So it makes long tutorials a lot shorter because you can just scroll through and different lines of code will be highlighted. So in essence, I always say docs are actually also your product. So if you have a good product but you have like bad documentation, it's not great. It's not great for your selling your product. It's always a good thing to have like a good product and also amazing documentation, so developers are really happy, they can onboard quickly, and they get to value as quick as possible. So if you want to get in touch, you can scan my LinkedIn code. And that's it. These were my 15 tips. Thank you. Thank you.
Before we do the Q&A, I do have a brief announcement to make, which is after the Q&A, we're going to be doing a group photo. So please, if you want to be in the photo, linger here. If you are outside of the room, please come into the room, tell your friends, tell your enemies, tell everybody. Right, so Michiel, that was really cool.
Yeah,
Thank you
was
so much for
quite
that.
dense.
It was quite dense. It's definitely one of the ones that you go back and look at the video and take notes, and yeah, it's going to be really, but it's really good to see the breadth of things that you covered. It gives a wide range of solutions, and there were a lot of questions that got asked as a result of that, which is excellent as well. I want to pick some of them out. I'm never going to be able to cover all of them. One of the ones that I thought would be a good one to kick off with is there are so many improvements. How do you pick which ones to focus on first?
That's a very good
No
question,
pressure.
to be honest. Well, I would always start like select a few things that you want to do in your documentation that you think are going to improve like the developer experience a lot, and then pick like some of the high value flows. Like don't focus your efforts on like all of the flows. If you notice that a lot of developers go to like a certain feature, follow these onboarding guides, like focus your efforts on these things, improve the developer experience, add like a code sandbox, do other things, and see if you can spot changes, if you're tracking metrics at least, in like user adoption, user flows, and like less support ticket, for example, or like a lower metrics in like your search, for example.
Okay, that's useful. So a bunch of people have asked, how can you cater for developers of different levels of experience in things like reference guides and like that? Or do you like end up with like two different kinds, some for the deep, some for the... How do you deal with that?
I usually start with like building the documentation for the beginner level, because often I'm dealing with like new products, so they don't have this advanced user base yet. So it's easier to start building for the beginner users and then work up our complexity. But if you are like an existing product and you want to do it, well, it's a bit harder because you have to cater to many users at the same time. But I would still say, like, if you still have like a lot of beginner users versus like more advanced users, try to divide your efforts like across it.
Okay. Related to that question, so you've had that flow chart of the different, the sort of the path through the documentation. If you're going to have a change in your document, in your audience profile as they become more advanced, can you use metrics or anything about who clicks on what next to help build a new version of it? Because you're going to have to. What do you do to update it?
In the past, when Google Analytics, it changed like a while ago, but they had like user flow paths, and I used this to like analyze like which percentage of traffic would like start with the getting started guide and how they would navigate throughout my documentation. And like based on like the width of each of these paths, I could like identify like which path is more valuable than the other path, basically. So that was one thing, but it was kind of complex, and I needed like a Google Analytics engineer to help me configure it.
Okay. It's coming from a slightly different angle, since we do have a lot of people who've been talking docs and code and things like that. So you've talked a lot about developers as readers, but obviously there are a lot of us who are also having developers as documentation contributors at various levels. Do you have ways that you can get developers to be interested in the content creation side, or provide stuff for that, or steer them to it from this stuff?
In some cases we do. For example, for open source projects, we often have like a contributing guides where we help them like how to get on board with their documentation, how to create your first commit to our documentation, and like we will embrace it. But yeah, you need to provide proper documentation for them as well to like start contributing.
Okay. Another metrics question. So how can you get analytics data from AI answer engines like RAG, which consumes your documentation and produces it? Since they're kind of outside of your control, is there any way that you can get that information back from them?
So some of the AI providers, they will provide these analytics. They will show you like how often people query certain things. So some of them do provide the analytics. Some of them, it's a black box, you don't know.
Right.
It depends on who you chose. I'm not going to say like which provider is best, but there are like multiple providers that can help you with this.
So it's a factor in who you choose.
Yes, it's a factor. If you want these analytics, you should prefer like a tool that also has like the analytics and maybe like processes it also for you. While some of them you have to do it yourself.
Calling back to an earlier talk, it's another question to ask then. Sort of jumping around a bit, but another thing that's useful, aside from the typical indicators, do you have other ways that you look at for evaluating developer content uptake? How is that sort of all those success metrics? What do you have that's like your secret sauce?
It's the same as the previous presentation, like the user adoption, basically. We look at how many people create accounts and do certain things, if they use certain features. If this goes up, it's a clear sign that some part of the documentation is doing well or is working well.
Okay.
No secret sauce there.
Oh, well, one can always hope. So there were a couple of people who actually wanted to look at the embeddable API playground slides. I think probably not going to do that, but will you be sharing your slides, or are your slides available so that people can go and look at them, chew them over in detail? Because I think that's something that a couple of people were looking at, and certainly API playgrounds are...
Yeah, like the main one is like the code sandbox is like an easy one where you can do whatever you want. And then whatever platform tooling you're using, you will find some sandboxes. Some are a bit rough, some are more advanced. Do
you have any tips for finding those? You know, how is it just sort of word of mouth? Everybody says Stripe is great, but how do you...
I think it's a matter of like trying to Google it and find it within your niche. And if you can't find it, you just go back to the code sandbox and you configure your own code snippet. You just have the user fill in like an API key or an SDK token, and you can embed this, and it's still like a great experience.
Okay. One last question. So a lot of people have proprietary tools. They're not using anything that's quite so open. Do you know of ways to get search analytics into those? Because those are really powerful, but it can be a pain.
I guess it depends on the tooling. Also, if they're like SOC 2 compliant or like other kind of security standards implemented. Some platforms offer it natively, but they're not as good as usually not that good. For me, Algolia was like the best I have found, basically, where you get like all these percentages. But if you can't use it for security reasons, it's a bit of an issue, I would say. Okay. I would look at the security standards and like if it fits your policy, your company policy or not.
Fair dues. Thank you so much. This was really, really interesting talk, and I'm going to be going back over it a lot.